Welcome to Third and Fairfax, the official podcast of the Writers Guild of America West. I'm your host, Brian Gary. This year has seen multiple newsroom strikes, massive layoffs, and sudden closures. In this episode's Uniontown segment, WGA West Asian American Writers Committee Chair Kristina Wu talks with Media Guild West President and former Los Angeles Times journalist, Matt Pearce, about how reporters are organizing the newsroom to push back against corporate greed and protect good jobs. Kristina Wu will then speak with writer and former journalist Albert Kim, developer and showrunner of Avatar: The Last Airbender, about crafting his new hit Netflix series, how Asian representation matters, and much more. Listen and subscribe to our Third and Fairfax podcast on Apple, Spotify, or Libsyn, and watch us on the Writers Guild of America West's YouTube channel. And now, Kristina Wu.
Hi, welcome to Uniontown. My name is Kristina Wu. I am the chair of the Asian American Writers Committee, and I'm very excited to be sitting here talking with Matt Pearce. He is the president of the Media Guild of the West, and we're going to be talking about unionizing in journalism today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's totally awesome to be here, and I do want to say off the top here how funny it is to have a journalist be interviewed by a TV writer.
It's your time to be grilled.
That's what I used to do. So this is going to be a very exciting experiment. Reverse journalism. I completely support it.
Let's just dive right in. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How did you get into journalism? What brought you to LA?
I am from a really, really tiny town in Missouri called Cleveland. We're talking 500 people. And I went to the University of Missouri. It has a really great journalism school.
Yeah.
But I actually didn't study journalism at first. I was an English major, wanted to be a creative writer, a fancy fiction writer. And it was 2008 when I graduated. And
Same,
it turns out there's not a lot of jobs for fancy fiction writers in 2008. Not necessarily all the other times either.
But particularly that year was rough.
It was a little rough.
Yeah.
So I didn't have anything to do. I was what you would call underemployed. And I was reading a lot of news about the presidential election and the economic collapse. And, fiction writing wasn't working out. But I was reading a lot of the New York Times and reading about Lehman Brothers. And I was actually, the New York Times is kind of well written. And I just want, I just want to be a writer. So I decided to go back and get a practical degree in journalism, again, at the University of Missouri.
Okay.
And then got my start at the LA Times when there was a massive tornado in Joplin, Missouri in 2001. It was really horrible. It was like an F5. And I emailed a bunch of national editors at publications and offered to work for the first one that called me back, and it was the LA Times.
Nice.
So that started what became a 11-year career for me at the LA Times. I actually just put in for my buyout and was accepted and left yesterday. So
Lots of questions about that.
yes.
Yeah.
And in that time, I was also involved with unionizing the LA Times, which had been famously anti-union for its entire history up until 2018.
Okay.
And then later became president of our local Media Guild of the West, which now represents newsrooms from Southern California to Texas. So we've been very busy in the union space, and a lot's been happening in the journalism world.
Practically speaking, what did it look like for you to be organizing a newsroom? As a WJ writer, this has been around for a long time. Someone called me, I had to do very little. But in terms of starting a union from the ground up, what did that look like? How did you go about that?
Oh, it was great. One day, one of my coworkers in the business section came over and asked me if I wanted to go out to lunch. And we were downtown, and we were eating at this taco place. It's right in front of the big shiny LAPD headquarters.
Oh yeah, I know.
And she said, I think it's in Your Fish.
Yeah.
And she said, hey, you're really respected in the newsroom. People look up to you. What do you think about forming a union? And I was like, first of all, I'm really respected in the newsroom.
Say more about that, yeah.
Which I learned was a line that was used perhaps on other people in our newsroom to butter them up.
And everyone else had said no before you, yeah.
Yeah. And so we did it, but it was crazy. So most newspapers unionized in the 1930s, Writers Guild unionized. A lot of people who are in unions that were formed in the 1930s or even earlier than that. The LA Times had never unionized. Famously, it was bombed by ironworkers in 1911, killed a bunch of people. The LA Times was, at the time, famously one of the most anti-union newspapers in America and had this tragedy that happened where a lot of people in the newsroom died because of this labor bombing. So for most of its history, the LA Times didn't have a union. So we went around secretly having meetings with coworkers in a newsroom. And, it's very funny, like try to keep secrets among journalists. Very ironic, actually.
I would think you guys are actually good at keeping secrets.
We're good at keeping secrets when we need to.
Sure.
Like state secrets.
Or like sources.
But then there are kind of like gossip secrets that are maybe not so
Sounds
well
like entertainment.
inside of a newsroom.
Yeah.
We're good at that stuff. But people would like say calendar events and say like we're meeting for book club, and some people would be like, they put a calendar event for carnitas, and that would actually be our secret union meetings that we would hold offsite where we would scheme against our employer. So it took forever because a lot of people these days, and especially a lot of young people, including me, had never been in unions before. Didn't really know how unions worked, hadn't had union jobs before. We just didn't really have a lot of entryway into the labor movement and what a union could do in our workplace. It's kind of a free-for-all.
Yeah. Wait, and just to back up, specifically what was going on in the newsroom that was creating this groundswell? Obviously, I'm sure pay was involved. I'm sure, workplace safety, like what specifically was happening that was making this sort of start to really bubble up?
A lot of people, and this is common in journalism, had gone years without raises. The industry, newspapers in particular, have been contracting for a long time. So a lot of it was money. The other fact was that there were obviously enormous pay disparities in the newsroom by race and gender, which turned out to be much worse than we expected when we finally got the pay data.
Like Bon Appetit vibes?
We're talking like criminal, in my opinion. And ironically, though, the thing that really set it all off was when the company changed our vacation time policy. We used to have accruing time off, and then they changed it to unlimited time off. And I have to say, unlimited time off always has to come in parentheses because it means that you can no longer bank it and it's no longer paid out with severance when you leave. So we decided it's kind of crazy that our crazy parent company is just like changing our working conditions.
It's like we get so little already, and now
it's getting
this.
worse.
Yeah.
Like it's actually kind of a pay cut. So that was the thing that kicked it all off.
Interesting. And when did that happen?
That was in 2017.
Okay. What was the time it took between that first lunch and then like really making it official and like announcing yourself, and what, like, just talk me through that?
Ooh, I want to say it was more than half a year, and some people had been at it for longer. Like it took quite a bit of time because we're talking to individually one-on-one hundreds of people who, many of them, like, don't want to rock the boat. They're already worried about their jobs.
Sure.
They're worried about being retaliated against, or, honestly, some people had a bad experience in the past with a different union. And, so, you go to them and talk to them. It's like, well, I was part of a guild and it didn't seem like that good. So like, I don't know if this one's going to do much good. So we had some like really complicated conversations with people, trying to persuade them that this was something that was necessary. And kind of looming over all of this is this existential question that's kind of about journalism itself, which is that, like, actually, what can a union do to turn around the existential economic threat that journalism is facing? And that was a big hurdle that we had to climb over. And so we had to have a lot of really intense arguments, discussions, a lot of listening. And I personally learned a lot about organizing a union. And it's something that now a lot of journalists have done as second nature because an entire wave of unionization has happened since then.
Right.
But the most effective organizing tool really isn't your mouth. Like, it's not the manifestos. It's just listening to people and listening to their problems and understanding that actually we all have more in common than we don't. And in fact, when we first launched our union, we did it anonymously. Like, we went through the newsroom with these little pieces of paper basically saying, like, hey, an organizing committee is formed and we're unionizing the LA Times. It was unsigned. And so early in the morning one day, we went around like putting those on people's desks.
Oh, wow.
And we had a website that had, some of our propaganda on it saying, like, here's why a union's good and important. But we hadn't exactly announced ourselves yet. So it was a little scared.
Yeah.
And also the company had gotten wind that we were unionizing, so they had launched a union busting campaign. And it was really crappy. Like, they had used like copy pasted like anti-union stuff that was clearly meant for like a different company. They handed out these big things of dice that said, don't gamble with your future. and then like had a little website that they had created that was like unionfacts.com/LA Times. So like they were union busting, but it was kind of like really bad union
in
busting.
a really lame way. Yeah.
Yeah, that actually turned out to be very effective for us because we're like, look at these idiots. Like, don't listen to them. Listen to your coworkers.
Right. I think in light of everything you're saying, I want to know more specifically about the one-day strike that you guys had in January. Was it just for workers of the LA Times? My understanding is that it came together very quickly. Like, can you talk more about that effort?
Yeah, so we actually very much were not intending to go on strike a few weeks ago. What happened is that, so we got wind pretty quickly that a massive layoff was going to be coming to the newsroom. We met with management and we met off the record, which is kind of unusual because our union, we do bargaining on the record. Any member can come in and watch bargaining if they want. We have it on Zoom.
Okay.
It's actually very public. And in our bylaws, members can
That's
come in and
cool.
watch negotiations. It's
Yeah.
neat. But these negotiations were off the record because obviously we would like to find alternatives to not having a massive layoff in our newsroom. And those weren't productive. And the thing that we got from management on the record at the end of those conversations is that yes, in fact, a massive cut would be coming into the newsroom. And they wouldn't say how many people it was going to be publicly, but we knew, and we knew that it was a massive number of journalists. And the company gave us this weird trolley problem, which was they would agree to lay off 50 fewer journalists if we agreed to largely suspend the seniority protections in our contract. So the way that layoffs work in our newsroom, and this is true for a lot of unions, not all of them, but the people who are newer are generally first in line for layoffs if there's a layoff.
Right.
The company has some skips where it can kind of skip over people and protect them. But that's generally how the layoff policy works in the journalism industry. And the company said, we don't want to lay off all these people we hired, which makes sense. But also they wanted to pick and choose the people that they wanted to fire. And that put us in an impossible position because as a union, like we don't play God with our coworkers' jobs.
Right.
Like I'm a reporter, and what's being asked of me is that I basically make it easier for some of my coworkers to get fired, but also that the responsibility of my coworkers not getting fired is also in my hands, which
Right.
is an impossible choice and the impossible choice of the bargaining committee. So we came to the conclusion, basically literally overnight, that we needed to go out on a one-day strike. So,
And do you guys have like a strike authorization vote like we do, or is it just like we're doing it?
this one was very much a we're doing it situation. Normally, and I think this is true for almost all unions, and including for the News Guild, which is our parent union, which we're part of. There's a strike authorization vote for open-ended strikes like the Writers Guild had last year, where you don't know how long it's going to last. There may be strike relief benefits. It's kind of like a massive event that has an indeterminate ending. There's a whole procedure for that.
Right.
But what the News Guild's become known for, especially in the last year or so, are doing a ton of one-day work stoppages. They're a lot more informal because it's just like you go out and then you come back in.
Got it.
It's not like an open-ended thing. And so we had this Zoom meeting over the lunch break the following day where I think 300 out of our 400 members showed up on the Zoom call. And we're like, look, guys, like this is the big one. And management has made this impossible dilemma that it wants us to sort of respond to. And I think we have to push back, and we can do that by going out on a one-day strike. So we didn't do a vote. What we said was like, look, go with your conscience. We're recommending that this is necessary because this is it. Like the newsroom's just going to look different if this thing hits. So follow your conscience, vote with your feet. And, we'll trust everybody to make that decision for themselves if they want to. And so I think we had something like more than 90% of our members walk out the next day. And we just arranged in a hurry. We already had a call list of people to try to phone up people and be like, hey, are you committed to walking out tomorrow? We organized a big rally downtown, actually across the street from City Hall. And it was beautiful. And when the layoffs hit the next week, there were 56 fewer layoffs than we were led to believe would happen.
Okay.
So either we were being bluffed
Right.
or our strike saved 56 jobs.
Right. How were you all treated after that one-day strike effort? Like, could you feel, a chill in the air when you went back to work. I think a thing that a lot of fellow writers and I have been talking about after this strike that we had is, it is kind of a wild thing to like fight back against your parents and then the next day be like, so
Yeah.
money, please.
it's a little bit intense, and actually it was frosty from the beginning because obviously the company withheld pay for everybody who
For that
walked
one
out
day.
for that one day, which they can do. But they went a step further, and they did something that other newsrooms haven't done. So the New York Times and the Washington Post have also done like one-day strikes recently in their contract campaigns. And the thing that the LA Times did to us that was different was that they froze us out of our email and Slack, which is how we all sort of communicate with each other. And
About the strike or about
just-
your unionizing or just like
just froze us out of our work email
Okay.
entirely, which was crazy because not only did they just sort of like block us from logging in, they actually suspended our email accounts. And so if you were a source trying to reach
Right.
an LA Times reporter on the day of the work stoppage, like obviously they weren't going to respond to you, but they would actually get a message back that was like an error message that like this account doesn't exist. And so we had a lot of people think that like the journalists who very much still had jobs had been fired by
Right.
the company. And we had like political campaigns that obviously are like emailing reporters all the times about the elections that we're covering.
Right.
And we had people getting pulled from mailing lists because their sources and their subjects thought that they had gotten fired. And so I thought that was especially vindictive. And our billionaire owner made comments in a newspaper story that appeared in our own newspaper attacking us, essentially blaming the Guild for our own layoffs.
Right.
Even though that we know that the outcome was, in fact, a lot less bad than it could have been.
You guys must always be talking about sort of that tension between you, as you explained. Obviously, you need actual money to do in-depth reporting. You need to pay your writers. You need to pay for gas, like all those very practical things. I don't know. It's like, how do you all as journalists talk about the idea of profitability versus just like, I understand that you guys need to make money, but I also like need to buy this plane ticket to talk to this person. Like, how do you guys square this?
That is one of the most interesting questions that journalists, professional journalists, kind of like in mainstream quote unquote journalists face today, because our craft, we are craftspeople, for the past century has very consciously tried to separate itself from economic motivations. So it's no longer that, we're trying to get those big print ads from Sears, which you're not going to see in the newspaper much anymore, if you even see a newspaper much anymore. Like that stuff is not paying my salary. We're trying to go find people on the internet where they're looking at everything. They're looking at Twitter, Facebook, they're watching Netflix, they're on TikTok, they're texting. Like we are fighting for people on this screen that is like this big.
Yeah.
And we are trying to be more interesting than Game of Thrones, which is crazy. And so the kind of crushing market forces that are just like a burden on journalists' shoulders is that there's analytics now where you can actually see how many people are paying attention to your work.
Right.
You can see how many people are subscribing, buying a digital subscription to your story after they read it. And that became like a big metric for us. And actually, to the extent that there was like a market force that was kind of not the worst for journalists, it's subscriptions, digital subscriptions, because that meant that you had produced work that was so good that people actually looked at that and said, actually, you know what, I want to pay for this.
Right.
Like that to me is healthier than like, we're going to try to like trick Google into being on the front page of Google so that like we can sell ads that no one's going to look at on a browser. So that was the model that a lot of newsrooms had been pursuing for kind of these last 5 or 6 years. And that is also the model that has come on under an enormous amount of strain in the last couple of years in particular, leading to all these big layoffs in newsrooms. So we now have this really horrible environment for journalists like me and my coworkers where we can only really be found on platforms like Meta and Twitter, whose owners are actively hostile to us.
Yeah.
They like don't want people leaving their platforms and coming to news websites. If you're leaving Facebook to go to a news website, that means you're no longer making advertising money for Facebook on Facebook's website or their app or whatever it is. And there are many properties. Instagram. Not only do Facebook and Google control the means by which knowledge is transmitted, our knowledge, the stuff that I'm paid to produce, they've also consolidated the digital advertising market. So actually the infrastructure of the internet, when you go and look at a browser and you see programmatic ads pop up, this is the stuff where it's like cookies are tracking you and they know that you were looking at like leg warmers and they're like, oh, are you interested in leg warmers?
Are you dancing?
It's 2021. Picture this, leg warmers.
Yeah.
And so those ads will follow you around the internet, and that has been enormously profitable for Facebook and Google. It's like oil money on the internet. Like they're just printing profits, like oceans of profits. And advertising used to be monopolized by newspapers.
Right.
And a lot of people had criticisms of that, but the beneficial side of that was that those profits were, for a time, funding journalists who were doing things like investigating presidents. But what you have with Facebook and Google are companies that have now taken those profits and are developing generative AI.
Yeah. Okay. I want to hear more about your personal involvement with the Media Guild of the West. How did you come into a leadership position? Yeah.
I became president of Media Guild of the West, which is our parent local. That when we unionized the LA Times in 2018, won our election, there just wasn't a news guild local in Southern California.
Okay.
So a local is, it's a parent union that includes a bunch of different bargaining units. So we're like, okay, we're the LA Times Guild, and we're going to form this parent union, Media Guild of the West. And we also knew that like some other journalists in other places were thinking about unionizing too. So we're like, well, we'll create this kind of ambiguous sounding local with a sort of generic regional name in case other journalists want to join us. And so like practically overnight, we blink and we now represent, oh my God, like Southern California News Group, which includes like the OC Register and LA Daily News, the Palm Springs Desert Sun, Arizona Republic, which is the biggest newspaper in Arizona, the Alt Weekly in Phoenix, Phoenix New Times, and basically almost every major newsroom in Texas. Like we almost like fell backwards and like woke up and realized that we had unionized like half the journalists in Texas.
Nice.
Like journalists everywhere see all the same problems. They're experiencing all the same forces, and they're like, this is crazy. We have to do something because it seems like our leaders aren't, helping us out of it. So I became president in 2020. My predecessor suddenly left, so it was kind of like a battlefield promotion because we were like, oh my God, our very influential first president is gone, left to the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos took him away from us. So I volunteered to become the local president. And volunteered, because I have to say that running for union leadership for journalists is really hard. I mean, like, and I assume this is true for other industries too, but I don't really know. But like, when you become a journalist because you really want to do journalism. Like that's you have a brain and can probably make more money doing something else. Like God knows I could be making like 3 times my salary by going into like corporate intelligence or something and writing like secret journalism for rich people. Yeah. But I want to write public journalism for everyone, which means I make less money. So a lot of journalists like kind of, it's hard for them to be like, actually, what about union work? Because, it's like, we got into it for the mission. Like we want to write about like, wrongful convictions and political lobbying and influence and, get laws changed and do all the kind of, fun stuff and like interview celebrities and write about
like
movies.
A whole different like career.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So you get into it because it's the craft that you love. And so if you get involved in like union leadership, it means like you're doing like a lot of stuff that kind of looks like shadow HR, where you're just in meetings all day and like talking about people's like personnel issues and like looking at healthcare plans and like looking at legal documents and doing legal drafting, and like that stuff isn't sexy. Like it's not going to get you the big promotion, so it's like there's not like a powerful incentive for anyone to become the president of our guild. But
that's important for labor.
It is important for labor. And it was a crazy time because COVID-19 just come to the U.S. So everybody in our newsroom had gone home. We had a massive furlough that we were having to work through and having to negotiate. George Floyd was murdered, and we had a lot of people look around our newsroom and say, we don't look like the community that we cover. And we had a lot of insurrections against various editors and managers in the newsroom. And so it was just a really intense time for me because suddenly I personally became responsible for, my 450 coworkers. And it was a real learning experience for me in learning how newsrooms really work, learning how news companies really work, and also identifying a lot of fault lines of problems that look like they're unsolvable or might be unsolvable at the bargaining table. And so since 2020, I'm dealing with all this stuff at the LA Times. Meanwhile, seems like half of every other journalist in America is unionizing their newsroom. News Guild's, I think, the fastest growing private sector union in America.
Wow.
And private sector unions generally don't get bigger. And at a time when every journalism organization in the world is getting smaller, the journalism union's getting bigger because there's so much freaking new organizing to the point where it's we have to turn people away because we just don't have enough resources to take on all these new campaigns all the time. So so it's very kind of schizophrenic, and I'm looking around at all of this, and I'm first of all, I'm stressed as hell.
I mean, we could do a whole other podcast about self-care and
skin routines,
labor organizing, or just
walks. Yeah.
keeping yourself in it.
Yeah, if you're doing
sane.
bargaining, it's very important to have a proper skin routine because it's very easy to get, really dried out talking to management. It's been an intense experience for us sometimes, but taking care of yourself is very important.
Very important. Well, I don't know that I'm getting the light, but I want to lead that into, you kind of gave us a scoop.
Yes.
You are no longer at the LA Times.
Yes.
What does that mean for you? What does the future look like for you?
I applied for a buyout at the LA Times and took it. I've been with the company for 11 years and had been active in Guild leadership nonstop for basically 6 years and in constant conflict with my bosses through that entire period. And I ultimately I really needed a break. And also, I had accomplished a lot of the stuff that I wanted to accomplish at the paper. And I also part of it was that bigger picture and realizing that there are all these bigger picture policy issues and structural issues that are making our lives so freaking hard and making it so impossible to do the journalism that we want to do that we have to start thinking about the bigger picture. And so I'm going to take some time to myself. I'm going to think about whether I want to do a book proposal or something. But what I'm also going to do is lobby over some important journalism legislation here in California and elsewhere if necessary to make big tech pay up for scraping and featuring and stealing from my labor, which produces the journalism that they love to train their generative AI on. And try to see if we can do something for journalists, not just in California, but across the U.S. And I think I am optimistic. I mean, as dark as things are, I think that policymakers look around and see that something isn't right.
Yes.
That we need to have journalism for a healthy democracy, and that there is a role for reasonable regulation to ensure that communities have the information that they need to self-govern. We can't just live in darkness.
No. How can non-journalists and journalists alike support what you guys are doing with the Media Guild of the West?
I would say just show up on a picket line is the number one, and don't cross them. And this applies to everyone.
I think that's tough now, right? Like when you guys had that one-day strike, and it was don't click.
Don't click.
Scroll past it on Instagram. I was like, okay, I'm
don't
scrolling.
Click. It's hard, but I also recognize that a lot of the role isn't necessarily on the public, because I think journalists ourselves need to be aware of the bigger picture. We need to be more knowledgeable about the forces that are making it harder for us to do our jobs, because we have to advocate for ourselves. And this is one of the principles of unionism that I really believe in. It's one of the things I actually find really admirable about the Writers Guild, is that you guys look at the big picture, because you have to look at the big picture to understand how does the economy work? How does it affect your ability to make movies, or how does it affect your ability to investigate a senator and to get this stuff in front of people so that they can engage with it meaningfully and not just in kind of an empty way and just as mindless consumers. I assume you got into this because you wanted to be an artist. I got into this. Well, I got into this because I love to write, but I also got into it because I loved telling people stuff and gossiping and being helpful. And I think the number one onus on us as journalists and as unions is to like look at the big picture, look at the policy stuff that could actually help us out. We cannot just get out of this thing by making individual choices where it's like, yes. And I will say that like for everyone listening to this, yes, please go subscribe to the LA Times and all your favorite news outlets, donate, do all that stuff. Look at the digital ads if you have to. But yeah, of course, like make your individual consumer choices. Yes. But like really the thing that we need is like, we got to have an information economy that works for humans. Right. Like we can't just have robots pumping garbage into our faces 24 hours a day so we can sell ads against it. Like there has to be something more noble in this for us to live our lives with. And I think that's the argument that I make to other journalists. That's the argument I make to unions. Like, let's go talk about policy. Like, let's go look at this legislation and see if there's stuff that we have in common that we can really push for. Because I think the public wants to help us out. I think lawmakers want to help us out. I think we need to tell them what we need.
Sure.
And give them the tools that they need to help us.
Yeah.
Because just saying subscribe is not enough anymore.
Right. Well, I could talk to you for 10 jillion hours about this, but we have to wrap this up. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you. And really, good luck in the future. Good luck with the Guild.
Good luck with the Guild as well.
Thank you.
Guilds of the world unite.
You just heard WGA West member Kristina Wu in conversation with Media Guild West president Matt Pearce. Next up, Kristina speaks with Avatar: The Last Airbender developer and showrunner Albert Kim.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Third and Fairfax. I'm Kristina Wu. I'm the chair of the Asian American Writers Committee. I'm so excited to be speaking today with Albert Kim. He is the developer and showrunner of The Last Airbender. He is an award-winning journalist. I'm really excited to dive right in and just start talking with you, Albert. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay, so let's just get right to it. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? I know you started off as a journalist, and I would just love to hear what drew you to it and writing and how you transitioned from journalism into television.
Yeah, after college, I got into journalism. It's funny, like writing is one of those things that I've always been interested in my whole life, but I'd never really thought of as a career. Like in college, I was pre-med, like any good Asian kid is. So, but I'd always worked at the school paper as well and taken writing classes, and that had always been a big part of my life that way. And I think I got a sign when I took the MCATs to apply to medical school, and my highest score was on the essay section. But that was probably a sign that medicine wasn't right for me. So that's how after college I took what according to my parents was just a little time off and started doing some journalism. So yeah, I thought my entire career was going to be in journalism. I worked at a bunch of magazines. I started at Sports Illustrated, so I was a sports writer for a long time. Then I went to Entertainment Weekly, and People magazine was my last major gig in the magazine world. And that's around that time I got approached by ESPN, who was interested in creating a show about the intersection of sports and popular culture, which fit my background really well. And so that seemed like an interesting opportunity, and I discussed it over with my wife, and we thought this could be cool. So we packed up the kids and the house and moved out here to LA. And then right after we got here, there was a change in management at the network and a shift in programming priorities, and my show got canceled very quickly.
And what was the show supposed to be?
It was a half-hour news show, kind of like Entertainment Tonight or Access Hollywood, but about athletes and sports. And it was based on a section of Sports Illustrated that I had created before. But that went away, and then so I found myself out here in LA with some time on my hands, and I'd always been interested in TV writing and screenwriting. So and at that time, FX was starting a show called Dirt, which starred Courtney Cox as a tabloid magazine editor. So my agent managed to get me a meeting over there, and they hired me as a technical consultant, just to advise them on the realities of the journalism world about being a magazine editor, which included everything from helping the production designer on the layout of the offices and writing little bits of dialogue. But most importantly, it got me into the writer's room. And those guys, the showrunner and creator, were incredible, and they still are. And they were so generous with their time. And Gave me an opportunity to write a script in that first
Oh, that's
season, my
amazing.
first script ever. Yeah, and they hired me on staff for the second season. And that show got killed by the writer's strike of 2008, 2007,
Mhm.
2008. So I still remember I got my WGA card on a Friday, and the strike started
Oh
that
my
Monday.
God.
So it was that was an interesting time. Um, but during the strike is when I actually wrote my first writing sample. And then afterwards, I got a job. I joined a TNT show called
Uh-huh.
Leverage, which was a lot of fun and fabulous. And then from there went on to Nikita at the CW. And then I went to Fox, where I worked on Sleepy Hollow. And then after that, I did some developing, which eventually led me to Avatar: The Last
Right.
Airbender for Netflix. And that's been a pretty long
I would imagine.
process.
I have a lot of questions about that. I want to rewind a little bit and just, I have to ask, especially coming out of a strike year, you joining the
Yeah.
WGA during our last strike, um, what was your what was like going through your head when you were experiencing that? Because like I graduated film school right as the strike was happening. So I think for all of us who were able to just get jobs at all, we were just so excited that that was a possibility. Do you remember like what uh how you were thinking and feeling at that
You
time?
mean back
Yes.
then in the
Yeah, yeah,
2007-8 strike? Oh yeah, that was really scary. I mean, I just started to get a toehold in the
right.
business. Like I said, I had just gotten my
Yeah.
card. Um, I'd written a second script, which also went into production the week the strike
Oh my
started.
God.
Um, So it was pretty scary, and that was about the only time that I considered getting back into
Mm,
journalism. I remember flying back to New York to take a few meetings, but thankfully my wife had a lot of faith and said, look, let's just see how this
yeah.
plays out. Let's see. We're okay financially for a little bit. She's the financial manager in my family, so I trust her on that front. And fortunately, the strike lasted three
Right.
months. It could have gone a lot longer. And like I said, I spent that time writing my first writing sample. My introduction to this business was so unorthodox that the first two scripts I wrote were produced, and I hadn't written anything before then. So I actually needed a real
Yeah.
sample, which is what I wrote during the strike.
Okay, I have a lot of questions about Last Airbender, but before we move on to that, I do want to ask you one more journalism question. Earlier in the episode, I also spoke with Matt Pearce, who up until very recently was a LA Times writer and is also the president of the Media Guild of the West. And we talked about organizing journalists and just sort of the state of journalism today. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts on like the state of like current print and digital media as it relates to consolidation and how capitalism has sort of like I mean it's always been involved, but how that is affecting layoffs, hirings, firings, and just sort of um obviously you were in journalism at such a different time. I was just curious what your thoughts are
Yeah.
on the topic.
I mean, it's really sad these days. It's a really rough
Yeah.
time. I still love journalism. It was like I said, my first career, and my heart was very much with all the people who still continued carrying on in that industry. But it's really difficult to watch. I worked at a time when magazines ruled the
Yeah.
world. I mean, magazines, but people could not wait for their weekly or monthly subscriptions to come in. And magazines, especially, I was fortunate to work at some of the bigger ones, like Sports Illustrated and People and Entertainment Weekly. And I worked at Condé Nast for a short time too. You know, they set the conversation. They broke news. They changed policy. They did lots of things, and to see all of that kind of slowly diminish and disappear is really
Mm,
sad. And I think a lot of it does have to do with sort of the consolidation of the big media companies. So competition has been, eliminated, as well as no one really figured out how to handle the internet.
yeah.
So and there was a long period of time. There was a period of time where I used to get contacted by former colleagues fairly
Mm,
frequently, just asking how to transition out of the
mm,
business. Some very well-established
mm,
journalists, and so it's been sad to see. I mean, hopefully there's a way out of the kind of death spiral they're in. I don't know how. People smarter than me have obviously been looking at the problem, but it, like I said, my heart has always been with journalism, and I'm kind of a journalist at heart still.
Sure.
So like to see where the business is now is a really sad thing. Just recently, Sports Illustrated has pretty much
I
disappeared.
know.
Um, and like there's an entire multiple generations of people who grew up with that as their
Yeah.
Bible. And when I was growing up, it was the place you just were dying to write for. And now it's pretty much gone. So that's very sad.
I suppose maybe one silver lining out of all of this very stormy rain cloud is that there's a really swell in organizing amongst journalists. And I would imagine that maybe despite you working in journalism in its heyday, um, perhaps the conversation around unions and organizing was a little bit different, I would imagine.
Yeah, back then, I mean, when you worked at the magazine, you were kind of in a little bit of limbo when it came to unions. We were, for a while, part of the newspaper guild when I worked in New
Mm,
York. Um, but like that only extended so far. At a certain point, when you became, I can't remember now, an editor or at a certain level, you were no longer in that union. So it was always tough. Like newspaper journalists had their own union. Magazine writers and editors didn't
right.
really, and that was a big chunk of the business. So yeah, it's great to see the union organizing now, but it's a question of whether it's a little too little, too
Mm,
late is my question about it. So and that has to do with the overall health of the
sure.
business, you know. So we can hope for the best, I
We should
guess
get you
is.
and Matt to talk because you guys would know.
Sorry,
Yeah.
yeah, well, I'd love to. Sure.
So transitioning now into television writing, was there anything about journalism that helped prepare you for TV writing and producing? Like, is there anything that you still carry with you from that time?
Well, I think the writing skills
Of
are
course.
similar. You know, there's the ability to write clean prose and be descriptive and all of that. And writing the lead to an article isn't very different from writing a cold open to a script or anything like that. That said, they are different muscles, and it did take me a little while to figure out exactly how to transition some of my skills into screenwriting. You know, I've said this elsewhere too. Like, eventually, I figured out that at heart, journalism is about the conveyance of information and facts. You know, you try to do it with style, you try to do it with emotion, all that, but that's the goal of journalism. Screenwriting, like fiction in general, is about the conveyance of emotion. You know, the facts are important in setting your scene and to different degrees depending on what your story is. But in the end, it's all no one's really watching a TV show or movie for the
Sure.
information there. It's about the emotion. So like understanding that helped a lot in my kind of education as a writer. Um, and that's kind of the key difference for
Mm,
me.
mm. Okay, we're now going to talk about what I'm sure everyone is here to listen to. Congratulations on the enormous success of Avatar: Last Airbender. I hope you're floating on
Thank
a
you.
cloud right now. Um, I think my first question that I have for you about it is, like I can only imagine how sort of daunting it could be to adapt a property that is so well known and so beloved. But you do have already experience in adaptation or working on shows that already came from some sort of source material. And I'm just curious, like how did working on Nikita and Sleepy Hollow sort of prepare you for taking on Avatar: Last Airbender?
Well, those other shows are fairly different in terms of
Sure.
adaptations. You know, Nikita was kind of it was a reboot, a reimagining of a story that had existed in different incarnations. And Sleepy Hollow was taking a lot of different stories and folklore that was familiar and remixing them in a new way. Avatar obviously came with a very large built-in fan base who have very high expectations for this show. So that is not something I took lightly at all. Um, that said, I made it very clear from the start of the project in talking with everyone that our show has never been meant to be a straight up remake of the animated
Right.
series. We were inspired by the original, and we wanted to stay true to the spirit of it, and that was always the key. But the phrase I've been using is that our show is a
Mm,
remix, not a cover. The notes may be familiar, but it's meant to be a new song. So, and there's various reasons, I've talked about it elsewhere, both logistical, financial, and
sure.
creative, about why you had to make certain changes. Um, but this was the process of, like I said, staying true to the spirit of the original, taking elements that worked, but then creating something new. You just had to, simply based on the format. We were taking an animated series that aired on Nickelodeon 20 years ago, and that was broken up into 20 half-hour episodes, into an 8 episode serialized drama for
Right.
Netflix. So just by the nature of the storytelling, it had to change. So that was the first thing to understand, and then you had to go through the sort of hard work of actually looking through all the narrative elements and seeing what you can use in building our
Right.
show.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions about this because I can imagine, you know, this isn't just like a sort of random OWA
Mhm.
project. When you, if you're able to talk about it, when you were approached about Avatar: Last Airbender, can you just speak more on like what were the things that for you in this remixing mindset, um, what was important to preserve? And then where were you like, let's take a chance or let's be brave and sort of invent so that we can make it not only work to going from animation to live action, but also taking like production considerations. I guess maybe production we can talk like the physical production is like a separate question, but yeah, when you got the call, like how long did it take you to like re-ingest all of the material and really just sort of sit and think about like what is your take and what is your perspective on the story?
Yeah. Um, when I first got the call, I was excited because it's a show that I loved and I'd grown up watching with my daughter. And like millions of fans around the world, it held a very special place in my heart. Um, then I was immediately daunted by the thought of taking on such a major property. And so my mind kind of shifted into first, I had to ask myself, why would we do
Right.
this, right? And then a bunch of reasons came to mind as I sat down to think about it. One was, like you said, in going from animation to live action, it, it literally dimensionalizes the characters. And so that to me was intriguing because one of the great appeals of Avatar, the animated series, was that it's set in a world that's inspired by Asian
Yeah.
folklore and legend. And that was incredibly rare, even now, as much as it was
Yeah.
then. So, like, being able to do that live action was very appealing to me. And, like, knowing that we could um, work with a cast entirely of Asian and indigenous
It's
actors
amazing.
in a franchise like this was just an amazing opportunity that I didn't think I could turn down. The other part of it was whether or not we could do justice to it visually, and that required basically assessing the technology available
Right.
now and saying, can we bring, because there's stuff you can do in animation that is incredibly hard to do in live
Yes.
action. Like you can draw certain epic sequences that to do in live action would be, financially and practically prohibitive. So when we sat down and took a look and said, yeah, we will be able to pull this off, that was another reason that you could do it. And then the other big thing was, it has been 20 years since that original show was out. And so the thought of being able to bring this story to an entire new generation of viewers was very appealing as well. Like, so in my mind, I could see, I remember sitting down with my daughter, who was very young at the time, and watching this show. And I was just hoping, well, there's a new dad out there who could sit down with his
Yeah.
daughter and watch this
Yeah.
version of the show. So taken all together, that like convinced me that this was a worthwhile opportunity to take. Um, and then you get into the hard part, the nitty gritty of breaking the story and figuring out exactly what can be carried over and what couldn't, what could be filled in, what could be new, and all of that. So that's the part that you rely on the creativity of the writers' room and your partners, your producers, and all of that.
Yeah. How much had you developed pre-room, and then what did you know going into your room, being like, I need these are all the things that we need help on, or that we really need to like beef up?
Well, before I joined the show, the original creators of the
Right.
cartoon were still involved. So I overlapped with them by a few
Okay.
months. So I was able to talk to them and then talk to them about the versions they had done and about the show in general. And then I went off and I wrote the pilot
Mm.
by
Hmm.
myself. And then when I turned that in to Netflix and and they were very enthusiastic about it, that's when they provided me with a mini room
Okay.
to start breaking the contours of the
Got
season.
it.
So that was about, I think about three or four writers or so for not that long. Um, and then we basically figured out the shape of the season, which I then did as a season
Okay.
pitch to the Netflix executives, who back then were Cindy Holland and Brian Wright. And that's when they gave us the green light to go ahead. And then I put together a full room to start breaking the stories and
Okay.
writing the scripts.
And as you're doing this in the mini room stage, I'm so curious about, obviously, the scale of this show is huge. There are multiple lands, there's so much costuming and VFX and battles, and uh how do you balance break, like, because when you're in a mini room, there's a version of a mini room where it's like you're pitching pie in the sky stuff and you're blue skying. At what point
Hmm.
are you in that process? Are you like, okay, we need to get real and maybe like we can't have that battle, or like this huge party scene that we want to have is actually maybe like a dinner scene with four people? Like, how do you balance that? Are you talking to your production executives and like, do you already know the budget? Like, how did you manage all of that?
Yeah, in general, I have this rule when working on a show that write it then produce
Sure.
it. Like I've always believed that write the best version of the show, and then you can talk about how can we afford making this version of the show. That said, it's a little hard to put away the producer cap
Yeah.
entirely. So they're going through the process of breaking the story and figuring out the season. There are definitely times when I thought, well, this is going to be hugely expensive. I don't think we can do, say, an entire episode filled with mythical creatures the whole time. So like that's kind of in the background, in the back of my mind as I'm going through. But honestly, in the beginning at least, in order to get the green light, you got to present the best version of the
Right.
story. And so it's the producer part of my brain is kind of like the Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder saying, "You can't afford that. Don't do that." But like at the same time, the creative part is like, "Yeah, but it's going to look awesome. It's going to look huge and
Right.
epic." So with a show like this, especially, I kind of lean more towards that
Yeah.
side. And then afterwards, sat down and did the hard work of saying, like, all right, what is our budget? What can we afford? How much of this can we actually pull off? So, and that the other part of that is working with your producing partners. I worked with Rideback
Mm.
um, and some great executives from there who were also incredibly helpful in guiding me on that part of it, saying like that's going to be a really
Yeah.
expensive episode or something like that. But it's a balancing act that until you actually get to the point where you have an actual budget, then you have to kind of keep it in the back of your mind, but don't let it completely inhibit you.
Right.
Because you got to sell the executives on the story. You got to sell them on the promise of what can be done. And that at times is going to be really big. And then you can sit down and say, well, this is how we can make
I
that work.
see. Yeah, so like if I were in that room, I'd be pitching like origin stories of Appa and like where did the air person come from? And then the executives are like, maybe not. Maybe we can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, again, in general, that's something for the showrunner to
Yeah,
worry about. So that's why I always tell the writers in the room, write it, then
sure.
produce it. Uh, what I always encourage the writers in the room is to go for it. Just do whatever comes to mind, and then we'll figure out how to produce it. As the showrunner, I have to keep that in my head a little more. But again, I don't really want to inhibit
Right.
people from the best
Were there
version of
any
the
things that you guys broke in the room and that you wrote, and then when you finally got to production, it's like not only can we not afford to do this and we have to take it out, but it changed the story, it changed season pacing.
Yeah, I mean, it did, but I don't think it happened at script phase. It was more in breaking the
Okay.
stories. One of the things we had the benefit of hindsight in that we know where the animated series
Right.
went. So there are certain scenes, stories, sequences that we all loved and tried to work in. And at a certain point, we would look at something and go, well, that was awesome, but that's as big as a season finale in
Right.
itself in that episode. Again, there's a difference between what you can draw and what you can produce live action. So we would have to like kind of grit our teeth and saying, all right, we're going to have to lose that episode because we cannot, practically reproduce that
Right.
as the seventh episode of the season. And in Avatar, for instance, in the first season, there's an episode called the Northern Air Temple, which basically plays like a season finale.
It's an
It's a
epic
massive
episode.
battle.
Yeah.
It's an epic battle, and like it would have been great to be able to have done that, but it would have drained all of our resources for the end of the season. So that's one of those things. Like I said, you just have to grit your teeth and cut it.
Right.
Same thing, and that applies not just to entire episodes, but sometimes
Right.
sequences within an episode. There, in the finale of the animated series is a intense sequence where Prince Zuko breaks into essentially the Northern Water Tribe, and he's swimming underwater, and he has to break through ice, and he emerges into these frozen caverns. It's awesome. Not something we were able to
Right.
do. Just again, practically and
Yeah.
financially is not something. So you had to sacrifice
Sure.
that. And once you start looking at it that way, then the puzzle pieces get a little bit,
Yeah.
clearer into how you put them together. So that's that's kind of the process that we had to go through.
I could talk about production stuff forever. I do want to ask you though, I think a thing that I really loved about the show and that I was constantly amazed by is the fact that there are so many tones that the show balances and really hard topics, like really devastating, heavy
Hmm.
things like genocide and totalitarianism and generational trauma, but also there's so much humor and playfulness. How do you maintain that balance both in the writing, but also in your writer's room?
I mean, that's really the trickiest part of the whole process is to figure out what that balance is and how when you tilt in one direction and when you go the other way. Again, the benefit of hindsight is that we knew how successful the original
Right.
series was, and they did it in a large part by balancing a wide range of tones. I will say though, in the original series, the later seasons tended to get a little darker in
Mm,
tone, and the first season was a little
mm,
lighter. So there was a progression there. We were able to look at that and see the entire range that they covered and work with that. Um, but it's not something that we ever had some kind of overall rubric
sure.
for, where we were saying like this is too far, this is not enough. It was just a process of feeling our way through the stories. And certain episodes and stories lent themselves to a slightly lighter tone, and certain ones lent themselves to a slightly, I won't say darker, but more emotional
Sure.
tone. So we would just lean in those directions depending on where the stories took us. Overall, it was all about making sure that they all felt true to the characters. That's the main thing. In the adaptation, plot points could come and go or could be adjusted, but the characters were the ones that everyone fell in
Yeah.
love with. So like making those feel like flesh and blood characters was the primary goal. And so once you did that and you started filling out things like their backstory or just some scenes that we didn't see with them, it automatically suggested a certain tone in an episode or a scene, um, and that's kind of what we followed, all along the way.
Were there any instances in which you all broke something, wrote something, and whether it's Netflix or your other producers, they read the script, they read the outline, and they're like, this is actually too dark or too kind of reaching outside of like the four quadrant realm. Did you ever have to handle
Um,
that?
I wouldn't say an entire episode. I think there may have been certain um, scenes or even just
Mm,
lines of dialogue or certain things. I remember in the fourth episode, we had worked in a storyline about Iroh, who's been taken prisoner by the Earth
hmm.
Kingdom, and he has uh, kind of an encounter with the lead
Yes.
guard who tells him about what he's lost in the war, and he's played by this wonderful actor named Albert Nicholas, who did an incredible job of conveying the depths of his pain. And a lot of his dialogue had to do with what he had lost and his experiences in the war, which is automatically a lot, I guess, more than what we had seen in the original
Sure.
series, and went a little bit deeper in that. And there were a few lines of dialogue that seemed to go a little bit too far when he was talking about his experiences on the battlefield.
Ah.
So we pulled that back
Hmm.
a little bit. I think at one point we had in there he still remembers the smell of burning flesh, and that felt a little bit too
Sure.
much. So we pulled back on that. But again, I don't. There was never any kind of litmus test for that kind of thing. It was just we did it by
Yeah.
feel as we
Yeah.
went along. That would have been dark for any show, not just our show. So but like I said, I always encourage the writers to go with their instincts in terms of where a scene or a character was taking them, and then we could judge
Sure.
afterwards whether or not totally it fit or didn't.
And I mean, I would also imagine it depends on performance too. Like anytime you have a captor and a captive, like that scene is going to be so intense, it's going to be so emotional. And depending on how you play it or how it's directed, it could be
Yeah,
subtle, it could be over the top. So, were you,
yeah.
what was the set coverage like on the show? Were you able to send writers to
I was
set?
on set for
Oh
the
yeah, you were
whole.
there.
Yeah, I was on set for the whole production. I wish I could have had writers on set to help out. And thankfully, because of the last strike, that will happen in the
Yeah.
future. But back then, we didn't have that ability. So I was in Vancouver for the better part of a
Okay.
year, on set by myself. So yeah, so I was working very closely with the directors on all of those scenes. And you're right. In in playing those scenes, there's a lot that happens in performance. So like when you talk about dark or mature, it's less about the material and oftentimes the intensity of the
Yeah.
emotion that comes across in a particular scene. And again, that's the process of going from animation to live action. You could take a scene in animation and word for word do it in live action, and it's going to feel more intense just because it's involving flesh and blood
Yeah.
humans in a real world environment. And so that's something we were aware of as well. So, that again, that's just something we kind of kept an eye on as we went
Yeah.
along. And it's, but we always knew that making something live action would make any of these things feel more
Of
visceral.
course. Of course.
So one of the things I think people have pointed out is, from watching our show is like firebending looks really dangerous. It's like, yeah, it should
Yes.
be dangerous. I mean, there's one thing to see it in a cartoon where it's cartoon fire and there's no visible, damage that happens from it. But in the real world, fire is
Yes.
dangerous. So they had to feel
Yeah.
dangerous. And once you do that, automatically it starts affecting lots of other parts of the story. It makes things feel a lot more real.
Yes.
That the firebender could come and kill you. So it's those kinds of things that created the reality of our
I
show.
mean, I felt that most when you see a flashback scene where the firebender's son like doesn't have the scar, and then obviously in present day he does. It's just like,
Yeah.
oh no, how do you get that
Yeah.
scar?
Right.
It's so
Yeah.
emotional.
No,
Yeah.
things like scars in on a flesh and blood character feel
Yeah.
different. Zuko's scar is the defining characteristic, physical characteristic for him. But if you watch the animated series, it's very simply
Right.
drawn. It's two shades, and it's the outline of a scar. When you translate that into the real world, and our brilliant makeup head, Rita Shikozi, she had binders full of images of real
Oh
world burn
wow.
scars, which she would present to me, and then we would look through all of them and figure out this is what it would look like. This is what it would look like on a person of his age. This is what it would look like after a year or two. It takes on a much more visceral
Yeah.
quality to it.
This does remind me of a casting question that I have for you. Was it hard for you while casting, especially the main roles, to sort of divorce yourself from the image of the character, of the animated characters, from like obviously seeing real life people? It's like maybe someone could look like a character in passing, but like how did you go about staying focused in the casting process and not getting distracted or caught up with like, oh, but this person looks exactly like that person, or is it more about like the essence of the character?
Well, part of our casting process was done under
I'm
secrecy.
sure.
So the auditions didn't specify it was for Avatar, and the characters weren't named after the Avatar characters, and they weren't scenes from the show. So they were all I had to write all these fake sides, and they range from like students in a math class to a father and son playing basketball. So in that sense, when we were watching the auditions, you could divorce it from the actual
Mhm.
show because literally was not the show. So what you were looking for was kind of the essence of the character in those performers. Was there something essential about their personalities that seemed to reflect the character that we knew they were playing, but they didn't. So, and sometimes, I would try and even tune out the dialogue
Mm.
because it had so little to do with the actual show itself. And that's kind of what you're looking for in the casting process. And along the way, I think, like, sure, there are times when you would think physically that's a good match, but like that also goes along. We made it a specific point that we wanted to cast actors that were close in age to their characters. A lot of times you see projects where they age them up a lot. We wanted to make sure that Aang, who's a 12-year-old, was played by someone close to 12 years
Wow.
old. Uh, so automatically you start seeing kids at that age and comparing them to do they look like Aang? But like you're helped by the fact that they're actually 11 or 12 or
Right.
13 years old
And
already.
you were lucky enough to
Uh,
find like the wisest 12-year-old child, mini Buddha on Earth.
Yeah, well, Gordon like captured so many um, elements of the character. So like everything from his playfulness to his sense of humor to his energy to the kind of deep emotion that Aang has to carry as well. So like he just had all of that within him. Um, but yeah, I mean it's definitely an interesting process when you're trying to convert characters who are so well known already and have a certain look and find those counterparts in the real
Yeah,
world. And like I kept telling myself, obviously, once they go through hair and makeup and the costumes, it's going to be a completely different thing.
totally.
But you do sort of look for those essential qualities.
Well, I mean, I'm not the only person I'm sure who feels this way, but like, thank you for just such a gorgeous breadth of Asian and Indigenous representation in this show. Like, I'm just so curious to hear from you. You know, you've worked through a bunch of different eras of how diversity and representation is spoken about and dealt with, both on camera and off. And I'm just curious to hear you maybe contextualize Last Airbender within this sort of like larger topic and just what your experience has been over the years and how things have changed. I mean, I know there has been an amazing amount of progress. There's still a lot more progress that needs to be made, but this show really, it was so beautiful. I was like crying at points, just like, look at all these people on screen. It's amazing.
Thank you. That definitely was one of the most gratifying parts of this entire experience is being able to populate this cast entirely from Asian and indigenous communities. And it was a gift to be able to do that. I remember at one point Daniel Day Kim and I were on set, in between takes, and we just sort of took a look around at the set, and not just the people on camera, but a good chunk of our crew and behind the scenes people, and we just sort of were like, this is incredible, and it just you just didn't see that, and both of us have worked in this business for a long time, and you're right, it was emotional being able to see that, and even when you got outside of the main cast, when you got the
Hmm.
background people in, and so that you're filling in this entire world with people from those communities as well, and of course they came with their own families and support people who were all just off camera, and like so it was incredible to see an entire soundstage filled with Asian and indigenous people at all times. And yeah, that again, I said that earlier, that was one of the biggest appeals to me of
Yeah.
doing this project is of being able to bring that to life. You don't see shows like this, especially at this scale, with that kind of diversity on camera. And Paul Sun-Hyung Lee, who plays Uncle Iroh, he puts it so well. He talks about how for the longest time, actors of color didn't get to play in franchises like this, and so it's very significant that that opportunity is
Yeah.
here now. And I think the amazing thing about it is that for those of us who come from those communities, it's great to see on screen. For those who don't, they don't actually think twice
Yeah.
about it. It's not like that's
Right.
weird, it's that's just part of the story. And it brings us a huge dimension to the story and to the show that may not even be noticed by a lot of people. Like, I made sure that when we had scenes interior, people were taking their shoes off. No one's gonna
Right.
notice
Right.
that. Like maybe no one will notice it, but like it was important to
Yeah.
me, and it's the kind of thing that informs the entire storytelling process. Everything like making sure the food was
Yes.
accurate, in certain communities. All of that kind of stuff is important because I remember as a viewer and even growing up, when people got that wrong on
Yeah.
shows, that's the first thing I
Hmm.
noticed. I'm like, that's not a Korean outfit on that Korean
Right.
character. Those kinds of things are the first thing you notice. So getting those things right was really important to me. And again, the majority of viewers probably won't notice it,
Right.
but it's important in the larger context of
Well,
storytelling.
and I would imagine it also sort of takes the pressure off of it because there is such a breadth of representation and so many different kinds of characters within all of these communities. Like you don't like in another show where maybe Daniel Day Kim's character is like the only Asian character, there would be a lot more discussion about like he's being a tiger dad. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
like, are we worried about how we're representing him as an Asian male, as a father, as a leader of a household? Whereas in this story, it's like that's just who that character is, and that's how his character affects his family, and it's within a like larger tapestry of all different human emotion. So I would imagine that like you're able to spend time in the room talking about frankly more important things than like how's this person going to come across.
you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's absolutely right. The burden of representation isn't on any one actor or character because you're portraying a broad swath of the population of the community, and so you can have different shades to all the different characters and not be, stuck with one depiction as being that's who an Asian person is.
Right.
That's who an indigenous person is. So, and that's exactly what happens in the room. You can sort of relax into the storytelling of it once you immerse yourself into that community. So, yeah, all of that was incredibly important to us, and that's why I think it was so important to me when I used to sit down with my daughter to watch this show and like expose her to this kind of
Yeah.
storytelling. And so that's kind of what led me to go on this journey myself.
Well, it's an amazing journey. I cannot. I'm hoping that there's more. I think we all are hoping that there's more. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for taking time out of your, I'm sure, extremely busy day to speak with us. But yeah, this is an amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for
It
having
was
me.
great having you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Third and Fairfax. You can listen and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple, and Libsyn, and watch us on the Writers Guild of America West YouTube channel. Also check out writtenby.com, the Guild's online publication, for more on writer craft, career, and union life. See you next time.